Hello everyone, welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding Mishnah Berurah Chelik Aleph, and we will be learning today, Miras Hashem, a significant piece of Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, as well as, I hope, a significant piece of Chav Zayin Amud Beis. We are continuing to learn Hilchas Tzitzis, and we pick up today in the midst of a very, very, very complex Siman and a complex topic, and that is the topic of Tzitzis where the beged has become torn, where a corner was torn off of the beged, complete with the tzitzis that are hanging from that corner. And we have all sorts of questions over here pertaining to whether or not you could take that corner together with its tzitzis and sew it to another beged, back onto the same beged, etc., etc. This is a topic that we began yesterday. It's a very difficult topic. So we pick up today in Chav Zayin Amud Aleph, and we are up to Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Zayin. However, for the sake of continuity, first I'm going to read the words of the Mechaber in Siv Beis, and then I'm going to briefly recap what the Mishnah Berurah said in Ois Katan Hey, because in Ois Katan Hey, the Mishnah Berurah introduces us to a machlokes between the Magen Avram and the Taz that is going to play in to the rest of the Mishnah Berurahs that we're going to have in Siv Beis, Siv Gimel, and a little bit in Siv Daled. And it's very complex, so we're going to have to halt cup. Says the Mechaber in Siv Beis here on Chav Zayin Amud Aleph. Einoi yochal likacha kanof k'moi shehu. You are not allowed to take the corner of a beged the way it is, im hatzitzios, together with the tzitzits that are hanging on that corner, uletafrei, and then to sew that corner bebeged acher, onto another beged. Now I'm putting an emphasis on the words of the Mechaber, bebeged acher. You can't take this corner with its tzitzits and attach it to another second beged. Pay attention to that, because that's going to be very important for the understanding of the Magen Avram. And what's the problem over here? The problem over here, says the Mechaber, Mishum da al kanfe bigdeihem ba'inan, because the Torah Kedosha tells us that the tzitzits have to be placed bekashrus al kanfe bigdeihem, onto the corner of the beged that it was intended for. Uknaf zeh, and this corner, la yahaya mi beged zeh b'shas asiyah. Over here, we're dealing with a corner that came from a different beged. So a very simple reading of the Mechaber yields the following case. You had, let's say, a talis katan. One corner of the talis katan tore off together with its tzitzits. Now, we now have two pieces. We have the rest of the talis katan. Now, let's imagine that when the corner ripped off the talis katan, it ripped off in such a way that the talis katan is still a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. It tore off in such a way that the beged still has at least four corners. Maybe what happened is the corner tore off by creating two tears at a right angle, so that now the beged actually has five corners. But the beged of the talis katan is still a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. So now it's a beged of a talis katan that's chayiv in tzitzits, and it has three tzitzits on it. On three of its corners, it has tzitzits. That's one piece that you have. The other piece that you have is a corner. You have a corner, and it has tzitzits hanging on it. Says the Mechaber, you cannot take that corner with its tzitzits and sew it on to another beged, not onto the original beged. We're not talking about, right now, we're not discussing the question of sewing it onto the original beged. We're going to discuss that in Mishnah Berurah Ois Katan Zayin, but that's not what we're discussing right now. Right now, what we're discussing is we have the original beged that the corner was removed from. We have this corner with tzitzits on it. Now we want to take it and we want to attach it to another beged. I have another beged of daled kanfos that's chayiv in tzitzits. Maybe I already put tzitzits on three of the corners. I need tzitzis for the fourth corner. So I have this corner of a beged that has tzitzits hanging on it. I want to attach it to that beged. Says the Mechaber, you are not allowed to do that. Okay, why? because al kanfei bigdei hem. You need that when you put the tzitzis, it should be al kanfei bigdeihem. It should go onto the corner of the beged that it was intended for. Now, over here, you have a corner with tzitzits on it, but it was never put on that beged. It had originally been put on a different beged. So you want to do a tzitzis transplant. You want to transplant without untying it. You want to transplant a corner from this beged to that beged. Says the Mechaber, you can't do it. Now, in Mishnah Berurah Hay, in Mishnah Berurah Ice Cotton Hay, the Chavetz Chaim introduced us to a Magen Avram. The Magen Avram looks at this case, and the Magen Avram says, what exactly is the problem here? The problem, says the Magen Avram, is essentially a tasev aloy min ha'asui problem. What's the problem? The problem is that when you removed the corner with its tzitzits from beged number 1, now you have a corner of a beged. How big is the corner of a beged? Is the corner of a beged big enough to have its own independent chiyuv of tzitzits? No. In order to have a chiyuv of tzitzits, you need to have a beged the minimum size that a katan, a minor child, could be misatef with that beged. The corner of a beged is not big enough kedei lehisatef. Therefore, that corner does not have its own independent chiyuv of tzitzits. So, when you removed that corner from the original beged, right? Now, I'm holding it over here. The tzitzits that are attached to that corner, they're no longer considered tzitzits. You know why? Because they're not on a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. Even if the corner happens to be a nice square, so it has 4 corners, but it's not big enough. It doesn't have a chiyuv of tzitzits. Since that piece of fabric does not have a chiyuv of tzitzits, the tzitzit strings that are attached to it are not really tzitzits. That's not what they are. Now, if you take that corner and you attach it to another beged, that's tasev aloy min ha'asui. When you attach it to the beged, now suddenly those tzitzits are going to, you're trying to make them become kosher tzitzits, because now they're attached to a beged that's big enough to be chayiv in tzitzits, and that has 4 corners. So now suddenly you're turning them into tzitzits, but you're turning them into a tzitzits after they're already made, after already knotted, after already tied. That's tasev aloy min ha'asui. So again, how does the Magen Avram explain the Mechaber? The Magen Avram explains the Mechaber very simply. You had a talis cotton. Everything was fine and dandy. You cut off or tore off a corner. When you tore off that corner, the tzitzits hanging on that corner really aren't tzitzits anymore, because it's not attached to a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. Now you want to take that corner and you want to transplant it and attach it to a beged that's chayiv in tzitzits. Tasev aloy min ha'asui. No good. You can't do that. But now, says the Mishnah Berurah, let's tweak the case a little bit. Let's say that the corner that you took off from the original beged was not the picture that we have in our mind. It wasn't a small little piece of fabric, a small little corner. It was a big piece. You took a corner off of a very big talis. And the corner that you took off is actually big enough, kedei lehisatef by cotton. It's big enough that it has its own independent chiyuv of tzitzits. So now let's analyze the case. You had a perfectly kosher talis with perfectly kosher tzitzits. You cut off a corner off of that talis. And the piece that you cut it off in a square. So it has 4 corners. And it's big enough kedei lehisatef. So it has a chiyuv of tzitzits. So the tzitzits that are attached to that corner, did they ever cease being tzitzits? No. They were tzitzits. They still are tzitzits. Now you want to take it and you want to transplant it onto another beged. Says the Magen Avram, that would be fine. That's not tasev aloy min ha'asui. Because, let's analyze the case. The beged that you're transplanting it onto, that beged is a beged of daled kanfos. It has 3 tzitzits on it already. When you put those 3 tzitzits on, you put them on bekashrus. You put them onto a beged that had 4 corners and was chayiv in tzitzits. So those 3 tzitzits are fine. The 4th corner with the tzitzits that you're putting on now Well, when you made those tzitzits, you made them on beged number 1. Beged number 1 was chayiv in tzitzits. So when you made these tzitzits, you made them bekashrus. There was no problem of tasev and asui. Now you cut it off beged number 1. Okay, it's still kosher. It's still attached to a beged that's a beged of daled kanfas and is big enough kedei lehisatef. So it's still kosher. Now you attach it to beged number 2. At what point did you ever have a problem? Where is there a lack of an asiyah? Where is there tasev v'loy min asui? Says the Magen Avraham, in this case, there is no tasev v'loy min asui. So, this would be kosher. That's what the Mishnah Berurah says in the name of the Magen Avraham. That in this case, it would be kosher. The Mechaber says, you need al kanfei bigdeihem. Says the Magen Avraham, over here, I don't see a problem. I don't see a problem. The chesaron of al kanfei bigdeihem is a tasev v'loy min asui problem. But over here, there is no tasev v'loy min asui, so the Magen Avraham says this is okay. The Mishnah Berurah Nice Cotton Hay says that the Taz disagrees. The Taz says, even if the piece that you took off of the original beged is big enough kedei lehisatef, and it always had 4 corners, so it was always chayiv in tzitzits, you cannot transplant it to beged number 2. You know why? Al kanfei bigdeihem. It's true that these tzitzits were made bekashrus, but they were made bekashrus on beged number 1. It's true that when you removed it from beged number 1, it never became puzzle because it was still attached to a beged of daled kanfas, and it was still attached to a beged of daled kanfas that is big enough kedei lehisatef. So you might look at it, you might say, what's the problem? It never became puzzle. That's also true. But it wasn't made bekashrus for beged number 2. Therefore, says the Taz, this is puzzle. So here we have a fundamental difference between the Magen Avraham and the Taz. The Magen Avraham holds that this halachah here of the Mechaber in Siv Beis is just tweaking a halachah of tasev v'loy min asui, and the explanation of the halachah of Siv Beis is when you took the corner off of beged number 1, the tzitzits hanging from that corner became puzzle, because we're talking about a case where the piece that you took off is too small to have a chiyuv of tzitzits. Therefore, you cannot transplant it to beged number 2, because tasev v'loy min asui. When you took it off beged number 1, it became puzzle. Now you attach it to beged number 2, you're trying to make it kosher again, tasev v'loy min asui. But if the piece that you took off of beged number 1 was big enough to always have a chiyuv of tzitzits, then it never became puzzle. You want to attach it to beged number 2, you can. That's the Magen Avraham. Taz says no. This halacha of Sifkat and Beis that introduces al kanfei bigdeihem tells me a new halacha. It tells me that it expands the psul of tasev v'loy min asui. The psul of tasev v'loy min asui is not only in a case where the tzitzis became puzzle, even if the tzitzis never became puzzle, even if the piece that the tzitzis are on was always big enough, since it was not intended for beged number 2, since there was never an asiyah bekashrus for beged number 2, you cannot transplant it to beged number 2. That is a synopsis of Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Hay. Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Vav is relatively simple. I'm not going to go back into it. Now we're going to pick up where we left off with Mishnah Berurah Ois Cotton Zayin, which is going to introduce us to another case, which again is going to highlight not so much a difference between the Magen Avraham and the Taz, but it's going to show us further how the Magen Avraham understands the Mechaber in Siv Beis. You see, according to the Taz, the Mechaber in a way makes much more sense, because according to the Taz, the Mechaber in Siv Beis is introducing us to an expansion of tasev v'loy min asui, which is very clearly based on the pasuk of al kanfei bigdeihem. The pasuk of al kanfei bigdeihem is expanding Tasav V'Lo Min Asui, and saying not only do you need an Asiyah B'Kashrus, but you need an Asiyah B'Kashrus for that beged. But according to the Magen Avram, that's not true. According to the Magen Avram, you don't need an Asiyah B'Kashrus for that beged. You need an Asiyah B'Kashrus. Otherwise, it's Tasav V'Lo Min Asui. So, with the Magen Avram, we're left with a little bit of a question. What exactly is the Mechaber pulling from Al Kanfei Bigdeihem? Now we're going to see the answer to that in Mishnah Berurah's Katan Zayin. Says the Mishnah Berurah, I emphasized to you when I read the Mechaber that the Mechaber says you cannot take the corner off of a beged and transplant it with its tzitzis bebeged acher onto another beged, onto his second beged. But how about onto the same beged? Let's say you have a beged of dal kanfus, you have a beautiful talis cotton. You cut off the corner, or the corner gets ripped off. And again, I'm going to give the same case that I gave earlier. The talis cotton itself, the original talis cotton, after you remove the tzitzis, is still chayiv in tzitzis. You removed it in such a way that that beged still has four corners. So that beged is still chayiv in tzitzis. Now you have this corner, and you have a puzzle of talis cotton. So you know what you want to do? You want to go downstairs to the sewing machine, and you want to put the corner back on. Are you allowed to do that? Okay, let's plug this in to the Magen Avram. The Magen Avram told us in Mishnah Berurah Eis Katan Hey, what we saw from the Magen Avram was, once you removed that corner from the beged, now you have a Tasav V'Lo Min Asui problem, right? Why? Because when you removed it from beged number one, the tzitzis became puzzle. Why did they become puzzle? Because the piece that they're attached to is not a beged that's chayiv in tzitzis. So this fringe that's hanging over here is not tzitzis. How can you call it tzitzis? Tzitzis are on a beged that's chayiv in tzitzis. This is not a beged that's chayiv in tzitzis. Now you try to transplant it onto beged number two that's chayiv in tzitzis. Tasav V'Lo Min Asui. Okay, let's plug that into our case. You removed the corner from the beged. L'chayra, those tzitzis became puzzle. Now you want to attach it back to the original talis. Well, if I asked you, you would say, according to the Magen Avram, it sounds like this should be puzzle. It's Tasav V'Lo Min Asui. You removed it from the beged, it became puzzle. Now you want to reattach it to the beged so that it should once again be part of a beged that is a chiyuv tzitzis. So you're trying to reawaken, you're trying to turn these tzitzis that have become puzzle, you're trying to make them kosher again. But there's no asiyah. There's no asiyah b'kashrus. So l'chayra, it should be a problem of Tasav V'Lo Min Asui. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no. According to the Magen Avram, it's not Tasav V'Lo Min Asui. And this is why the Mechaber said, beged acher. It's a problem to transplant it to a different beged. It's not a problem to reattach it to the same beged. But why not? Why isn't it Tasav V'Lo Min Asui? So what we're going to see is that since you're reattaching it to the same beged that it was removed from, halachically we look at it as if it was never removed. We negate the idea that it was removed. We don't look at it that it was removed, it became puzzle, and now you're reattaching it and trying to make it kosher again. So there's a problem of Tasav V'Lo Min Asui. We don't look at it that way. We look at it that since it was removed and you are putting it back in its original place, you're reattaching it to the beged that it came from, it's as if it was never removed. Once you reattach it, it's as if it was never removed. And since it's as if it was never removed, it never became puzzle. And since it never became puzzle, there's no Tasav V'Lo Min Asui. So now we understand how the Magen Avram understands the Mechaber. The Mechaber in Sif Beis is saying like this: to remove it from beged number one and to put it on to beged number two, over there's a Tasav V'Lo Min Asui problem. Why? Because the pasuk says, Al Kanfei Bigdeihem. You need that the Asiyah B'Kashrus was made for that beged. You're trying to transplant it to a second beged. You can't transplant it to a second beged because then tasav v'loy asui. It was kosher. You removed it. It became puzzle. You're trying to transplant it to beged number 2. You're trying to make it kosher again. Tasav v'loy asui. V'asu kanfei b'gdayim. That second beged is not the beged that it was made for. But if you're trying to put it back onto the same beged, then you fulfill the requirement of va'asu al kanfei b'gdayim. It was made b'kashrus for that beged. It became puzzle when you took it off? No. Since it was made for that beged, and you're putting it back on that beged, it fulfills the requirements of va'asu al kanfei b'gdayim. We look at it as if it was never removed, and there's no tasav v'loy asui. Beautiful. This is the Magen Avram. Let's take a look at the Mishnah Berurah inside Eis Katan Zayin. It's so geschmack that it's killing my voice. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Bebeged acher. The Mechaber said, when is this a problem? If you're trying to transplant it to a beged acher, to a different beged. But, says the Chavetz Chaim, Avalim yirtza lechaber hakanaf lahabeged shenikra bibenu. If you want to reattach the corner with its tzitzis to the beged that it was removed from, afilu im nikra legamri, even if it ripped completely off, v'loy nishtayer kol shehu bakibur, and it's not attached even to kol shehu, it's not even slightly attached to the beged. It ripped off the beged in ganzen. Ein tzarech lahata mimenu atzitzis. You do not have to remove the tzitzis from that corner and reattach them. V'loy mifsala mishum tasav v'loy b'na asui, and there is no psul of tasav v'loy b'na asui. Why? Kevan de tchilas asiyasai bebeged zeh haya bekashrus. Since there was an asiyah bekashrus for this beged, that asiyah bekashrus carries through even when it was ripped off and it became puzzle. Doesn't matter. Why? Because we look at it as if it was never detached. However, the caveat to this is, like I mentioned, this is only effective if when the corner was cut or torn off, the rest of the talis cotton still retained a chiyuv of tzitzis. It still had dal kanfas. But if it tore off in such a way that now that beged only has 3 corners, then you have a problem. The chanal b'sif cotton vav, because then the whole original talis became patur and tzitzis. If the whole original talis became patur and tzitzis, then you have to remove all the tzitzis and reattach them. It's only because the original talis cotton retained its status of being a beged that's chayiv and tzitzis, it never lost it. So when you reattach the torn off corner, you're reattaching it to a beged that was always chayiv and tzitzis. So then there's no tasav v'loy asui. V'gam dafke, another caveat. V'gam dafke im hakanaf matzik al kalpanim shalosh al shalosh. There's another requirement, which is that the corner that rips off has to be at least 3 etzbais, at least 3 finger breadths by 3 finger breadths large. The Chibesamach Sif Daled, that's based on halachah that we're going to see shortly in Sif Daled. Kol zehu l'dasa shulchan aruch v'amagen Avram b'Sif Katan Gimel. Everything that we've said over here is based on the Magen Avram and the Shita of the Mechaber, like I explained. Aval Taz b'Sif Katan Gimel, but not the Taz. The Taz does not agree with this. Taz Paisik she'ein nafkamina. There's no difference. Beinim atziruf lebeged acher, whether you're trying to reattach it to the original beged, to a different beged, whether you're trying to transplant the corner to beged number 2, oyzeh gufa, or you're trying to reattach it to the original beged, hakol hu b'chlal tasav v'loy mina asui. The Taz is very machmer, and he holds that even this would be tasav v'loy mina asui. V'yesh lahakmer, and the Mishnah Berurah says we should be machmer. V'chein pasak b'derech hachayim, and that's the way the derech chayim also paskins. So we had the Magen Avram, And we have the Taz, who consistently over here is machmir over the Magen Avram. Remember, the Magen Avram said, if the corner rips off and is big enough kedei lehisatev, there's no Taz v'lo minasui problem. The Taz said, no way. It rips off and you want to transplant it to a different beged? No, you can't do that. Taz v'lo minasui. Al kanfei b'gdeim. It was never intended for that beged. Puzzle. The Magen Avram says you want to reattach it to the original beged, even if it was a tiny piece of fabric, so it became puzzle when it was torn off. If it's going back onto the original beged, that's fine. It has siya b'kashrus for that beged, it's okay. Taz says, no. Even if you're reattaching it to the original beged, it's still puzzle, because once it was taken off, now you're putting it back on. That makes the original beged a new beged. Taz v'lo and also you can't do it. Al kanfei b'gdeim. Okay. That concludes this unbelievable Sifkat and Beis. Now let's go to Sifkat and Gimel. And we're going to expand upon this a little bit and go to another case. Says the Mechaber 2 lines off the bottom. Talis mitzrieses kihilchasa. You have a talis gadol or a talis gotten that is beautifully kosher. It has proper tzitzis on all four corners. Shechilku l'shtayim, and you cut it in two. Ubechal chelik yesh bo shir lehisatev. On each half of the garment, each half still retains a chiyuv of tzitzis. Each half is still large enough to be a talis in its own right. V'indisha halachas behem, and each section of the talis still retains tzitzis achas, either one corner of tzitzis, or shtayim, or two corners of tzitzis. Ein boy mishum tasa v'lo min ha'asui. There's no halacha of tasa v'lo min ha'asui here. Now the Mechaber is a little bit vague. What does that mean, that there's no tasa v'lo min ha'asui? What exactly is it that you're trying to do? How are you trying to repair this garment? What exactly is the case? The Mechaber does not say. This is Torah Shabbat Peh, right? We need Rashi and Tosfos to explain what the Mechaber means. So let's take a look here in the Mishnah Berurah. And again, we're going to have to look at it to a certain extent through the eyes of the Magen Avram and through the eyes of the Taz. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut so b'chol chelik. So the first thing that the Mechaber told us is, we're talking about a case where you split the talis in two, but each side is large enough to have its own independent chiyuv of tzitzis. In that case, there's no tasa v'lo min ha'asui. Okay. So before we even ponder what the back end of the Mechaber means, that there's no din of tasa v'lo min ha'asui here, let's ponder what the front end of the Mechaber means. The Mechaber says, I'm talking about a case where each half was big enough to retain the chiyuv of tzitzis. How about if they weren't? How about if they were too small? Says the Mishnah Berurah, if each section of the torn talis is not big enough, kedei lehisatev, so it does not have a chiyuv of tzitzis, so now what do you have? You have two pieces of fabric, and each one has two corners of tzitzits on it, but neither one of them is chayiv in tzitzits. So how are any of these four tzitzits considered tzitzits? None of these four tzitzits are considered tzitzits because they're not attached to a garment big enough to have a chiyuv of tzitzits. Therefore, says the Mishnah Berurah, like our talis cuttings. If you cut them in half, you're not going to have two pieces that each have a shared talis. You don't, when you split it in half, they're not big enough. So then, so then they're no longer considered part of the mitzvah tzitzis because they're not chayiv tzitzis anymore. And the tzitzis aren't considered tzitzis anymore. And now if you want to reattach the two halves of the garment, or you want to take another piece of fabric and attach it to one to make it big enough, you zikr would have to untie and remove all of the tzitzits. Because otherwise it's tasa v'lo min ha'asui. You had a talis, it was chayiv tzitzis. You ripped it in half, now it's too small. It's not chayiv tzitzis anymore. The tzitzits that are on it are no longer tzitzits. Now you want to attach another piece of fabric and make it chayiv in tzitzits, or you want to reattach the two halves and make it chayiv in tzitzits again. Tasav v'loiman asur. You have because it all became puzzle. So you have to take off the tzitzits and you have to reattach them. But if one half retained a chiyuv of tzitzis and the other half did not, ein tzarich lahatir rak me'achelik she'ein boy. Then you would only have to take off the tzitzits from the side that does not have a chiyuv of tzitzis. So again, you had the talis cutting, you cut it 3/4 to 1/4. The 3/4 side retained a shared tzitzis. The 1/4 side did not retain a shared tzitzis. So then the Mishnah Berurah says, okay, so then you have to take the tzitzits off of the small side. Because when the small side was separated from the big side, the small side became puzzle. Now you want to reattach it, you have to take off the tzitzits, reattach it, put the tzitzits back on. Says the Shar Tzion in Ois Cotton Yud Ches, well, that's true according to the Taz, but not according to the Magen Avram. Because according to the Magen Avram, this is mamish the case that we discussed according to the Magen Avram and Ois Cotton Zion. What happened? You had a talus, you took off a corner. The corner is too small to have a chiyuv of tzitzits. Said the Magen Avram, you want to put it back onto the original beged, it's fine. There's no tasav v'loiman asui. Since you're putting it back onto the original beged, it's as if it was never removed, it never became puzzle, it's fine. That's exactly this case. You had a talus cotton, you cut it in two pieces. One piece was big enough to have a chiyuv of tzitzits. The other piece was too small. According to the Magen Avram, if you're reattaching it, it never lost its status of tzitzits. It never became puzzle. It's as if it was never removed. So, according to the Magen Avram, you don't have to take off those tzitzits and then put them back on after you reattach the two pieces. Only according to the Taz. According to the Taz, you have to. Why do you have to, according to the Taz? Because once you removed the small piece from the big piece, when you want to reattach it, it's a new beged. Al kanfei bigdayim. It was never made b'kashrus for that beged. So according to the Taz, you have to take it off and you have to reattach it. Okay. Ice cut and test. Ein boy. Now we get to the back end of the Mechaber. The Mechaber said, in this case, if you cut the talus in half, and each half was big enough to retain a chiyuv of tzitzits, the Mechaber said, Ein boy mishum tasav v'loiman ha'asui. Now, the Mishnah Berurah is going to break down what exactly is it that you're trying to do. And what does it mean? Ein boy mishum tasav v'loiman ha'asui. Says the Chavetz Chaim, Da tzitzis shenish'aru ein shem psol aleim. The reason there's no problem of tasav v'loiman ha'asui is because the tzitzits never became puzzle, came the yesh ben k'dei shir ituf. Again, you took a talus, you cut it in half. Each piece is still big enough to be a talus in its own right. Each side still retains the chiyuv of tzitzits. So the tzitzits that are on each half never became puzzle. Okay. Al kain, therefore, says the Chavetz Chaim, im yirtze, if you want, yochel litzaref la'oisei achetzi chaticha mi beged acher. So now, you can take one side, right? It's big enough to be a talus, and it already has two tzitzits on it. And there's no problem of tasav v'loiman ha'asui on those two tzitzits. They were made b'kashrus. Now you take another piece of fabric and attach it to this talus and put on two new corners of tzitzits on the other side. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's fine. So you want to take yachal etzaref loisei achetzi chaticha mi beged acher. You could put on a new piece of fabric, v'lasei tzitzis chadoshim ala kanfei chadoshim, and put new tzitzits on those two corners. No problem. So again, what are we saying over here? The case is we have a talus or a talus cotton. It was cut in half. I've got 2 tzitzits on each half, and the Mishnah Berurah is telling me over here, if I want, I could take, as long as each one of these sides retained the shear of tzitzits, if I want to take a new piece of fabric and attach it to either one and put on 2 new tzitzits, either way, it's going to be fine. Why? Very simple. It was a kosher talis. Now it's a half of a kosher talis, but it still has the necessary shear. It has an independent chiyuv of tzitzits. The 2 original tzitzits that are on that piece were put on bekashris, on that beged. Now I'm going to take 2 new corners of tzitzits, put them on that beged bekashris. It's fine. Continues the Mishnah Berurah here, top line, Chav Zayin Amud Beis, v'chol shekain, certainly, sheyachal lasais min hachetzi tal shalem. Certainly what you could do is, if you have each half of this talus, and each half is big enough to have an independent share of a talus, so you cut it in half, now you want to just make each one into its own talus by affixing 2 new corners of tzitzits to each half. You could do that also. That's fine. And that's what the Mishnah Berurah says. V'cholshken sheyachal lasais ben hachetzi tal shalem. Dainu sheyaseh shtei tzitzis al hakanfei samechudashim. By putting two sets of new tzitzits on the now new corners that were formed by cutting it in half. Now we get to an interesting case here in the Mishnah Berurah. What if you had the talus, you cut it in half, each half has 2 tzitzits, each half is big enough to have the sheer talus. Now what you want to do is, you want to reattach the 2 halves. Well, according to the Magen Avram, this is definitely not a problem. Because remember, the Magen Avram said, even if you took off one corner of the talus, and that corner is too small to have a sheer talus, so by taking it off, you rendered the tzitzits on that piece puzzle, you're still allowed to replace it onto the original beged, and there's no tasa v'loibina asli problem, because it's going back onto the original beged, so we look at it as if it was never removed. So according to the Magen Avram, this is fine. You had a kosher talus, you cut it in half. This case is even better, because in this case, each half still has a sheer talus. So you could definitely reconnect it, and there's no problem. But according to the Taz, it is a problem. Why? Because remember, the Taz said, once you removed a corner from a beged, now, if you want to reattach it, you're creating a new beged, right? You had the talus, it was one beged. You cut it in half. Now, it's 2 small begadim. Now, when you reattach it, you're once again forming a new large beged. Oh, according to the Taz, that's a problem of Tasa v'Leiben Asli. Why? Because even though the 2 sets of tzitzits on the 2 halves never became puzzle, because they were always on a garment of Dalet Kanfas that was big enough to have a shared tzitzits, doesn't matter. Now when you put them back together, you're forming a new beged, and these tzitzits were not made for this beged. Yes, they were made for the original uncut beged, but that beged's gone. That beged went away when you cut the beged in half. That beged is history. Now you have 2 small begadim. Now you have the 2 small begadim, you sew them back together again, you're creating a new beged. You had beged number 1, which was the whole uncut talus. Then you had begadim 2 and 3, those were the 2 halves. Now when you reattach it, you have new beged number 4. These tzitzits were never made for beged number 4. So according to the Taz, that's a problem. Says the Mishnah Berurah inside. If you want to reattach the 2 halves, when they had been cut into 2 sections, now you want to reconnect them one to the other. Yesh oimrim, there are those that say, and the Sharatzion says Taz derech HaChaim. This is based on the Taz. Yesh oimrim titzarich mitchila laHaTorah tzitzis min chelek echod. This is very interesting. Yesh oimrim titzarich mitchila laHaTorah tzitzis min chelek echod. You have to take off the two tzitzits from one of the two pieces, right? You had a talus, big talus, it had 4 tzitzits. You cut it in half, now you have 2 halves, each one is 2 tzitzits. Says the Taz, if you want to reconnect it, first you have to take off 2 of the tzitzits from one side, then, says the Mishnah Berurah, va'achar kach yitferenu, then sew the 2 sides together, va'achar sheyitferenu, and after you sew them back together, yatul by tzitzits, put the 2 tzitzits that you removed back on. Why do you have to do this? Because if you don't take it off, have a b'chlal tasa v'loy min ha'asui, you have a tasa v'loy min ha'asui problem. So let's go mikal al-kaved. According to the Taz, why do you have a tasa v'loy min ha'asui problem? Because again, the Taz holds that when the Mechaber says that you need va'asu al kanfei bigdehem, the tzitzits have to have an asiyah b'kashrus for that beged. You cut the beged in half, that beged is history. When you reconnect it, you're creating a new beged. These tzitzits were not made for that beged. So that's why there's a Taz of eliminasi problem. That's the easy part of the Taz. Says the Taz, what's the Eitzah? The Eitzah is take off 2 of the tzitzits from one half, sew the 2 begadim back together again, and then reinsert those 2 tzitzits on that corner, and now you took care of the Taz of eliminasi problem. The kasha on the Taz is a relatively obvious kasha. Why is it enough to take off 2 of the tzitzits? Why don't you have to take off all 4 tzitzits from both sides? Right? All 4 of the tzitzits are a problem. All 4 of these tzitzits were made bekashrus for the original uncut beged. You cut the beged in half, that beged is gone. Now when you reattach it, l'chayr, according to the Taz, you have taser v'lomanasi on all 4 corners. So why is it enough to take off only 2 of the corners? The Taz answers the question. The Taz says, you know why? Because you cut the beged in half, you have 2 halves, each one has 2 tzitzits. When you take off 2 of the tzitzits from one half, what are you left with? You're left with one beged that has 2 tzitzits on it, and you're left with a second beged that has no tzitzits on it. Says the Taz, the beged that has no tzitzits on it is clearly inferior to the beged that has 2 tzitzits on it. Memela, when you reconnect it, the one that has no tzitzits on it is bottle to the one that does have tzitzits on it. Once it's bottled to the one that has tzitzits on it, the one that has tzitzits on it is viewed halachically like the original beged. If you would leave all the tzitzits on, so then you have 2 begadim that are equal in stature. When you reconnect them, you're creating a new beged. But if you have one half with tzitzits and one half without tzitzits, then the half without tzitzits is bottled to the half with the tzitzits. The 2 tzitzits on the side that has the tzitzits had an asiyah b'kashrus for that piece. This piece is bottled to that piece, so it's enough to just reinsert the 2 tzitzits on that side. I'm telling you, this Siman and this sif is amazing. And I'm only giving you, Rabbi Isai, the tip of the iceberg. Really. We could go on and on and on. What pshat in the Magen, what the deeper pshat in the Magen Avram is, the deeper pshat in the Taz. This is such a complex sugya. It's very enjoyable. Okay. So according to the Taz, that's what you would have to do. Aval, however, says the Chavetz Chaim, roiva achrayim mekilim. Most of the achrayim are mekel in this case. The Seivrim, and they hold that this is not tasa v'loy min ha'asui. Ice cut and chaf and the Sharetzion. Who is this? The Darkei Moshe and the Magen Avram b'sif cut and gimel. This goes back to the Magen Avram. According to the Magen Avram, why is there a problem here? There's no problem here at all. What you're doing is you're reattaching to the original beged. Reattaching to the original beged is never a problem. Even if the piece that was cut off didn't have a shared tzitzits, and the tzitzits that are on it became puzzle. Still, if you're reattaching it to the original beged, the Magen Avram holds it's not a problem. So, Roiv Achrayim go like the Magen Avram, and the Mekel, they say this is not a problem. Nevertheless, says the Chavetz Chaim, Toiv lahachmir lechatchila, it would be good to be machmir lechatchila. Okay, going to stop over here. I thought we were going to get a little bit weiter, but it is what it is. We have to do justice to the subject matter. We can't just do justice to the schedule. So we're going to stop over here, and Mir Hashem will do Sif Dalid and the rest of the Mishnah Berurah on this page, and maybe a little bit more in the next chair. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. This list of limud HaTorah should be making against Klal Yisrael. The Rosh should say, Yeshua Sefer Parnasset Shetukim to all those in need, and we should be zeichet to see the Bias Girl Tzedek. B'mher v'yameinu, amen. Be well.